Okay, good morning everyone, and welcome back, and welcome to those watching on the web streaming. I'm very happy to be chairing this parallel session on translation and tourism, mishaps and opportunities. Before we start, please make sure your mobile phones are on silent, the usual stuff. And I do apologize to those of you in this room. It is not exactly the most conducive room to having a nice discussion. It was formed for other reasons to do with political discussions. This is why there's the face-to-face format, not exactly ideal for our circumstance. And I do apologize for those of you who are sitting behind us as well. We will be looking to take some questions from Slido. I know that you're all very keen on sending your questions, and there are far too many questions that we can get to address. I do apologize about that. And perhaps we're going to look at solutions as to how we can get around that next year so you don't feel frustrated. But we would like you to send them in nonetheless, please, and we will be taking some questions from the floor as well. Now, I'm sure everybody in this room has been a tourist at some point in their life. It's something that we've all done. We've all traveled. Even those of you who don't come from Brussels and are here today, and you're here for work, but in some respects you're also tourists as well. So we have first-hand experience of the translation in this field and the fact that it can be a bit variable. So whether it's restaurant menus or whether it's museum exhibits, guidebooks, hotel websites, and we can see when it's not done well, it's very obvious, particularly to us who work in the industry. But does this really matter? Some people may actually find it charming or funny to see mistakes in translation. It's all it's quite nice, and we don't need professional translators in this field. Let's see perhaps if our expert speakers can change people's minds on that and think that we do need professional translators. Our three speakers this morning work in translation that covers different aspects of the tourism industry. And what I'd like to do is, rather than me introducing them, I'd like them to introduce themselves, tell a little bit about their background, and explain their connection with the tourism industry. So I'd like to start with Françoise.
Okay, so my name is Françoise BAJON, and I'm the CEO of a translation company in France. And although the company, let me finish about it. So, excuse me. You took me because we were not supposed to introduce ourselves. So. Okay, so I've been in this industry for 30 years. Apart from my company, I've also had a certain number of roles, including the president of LEIGH for 7 years, and belonging to the expert group LIND here at the EU. And as such, I've been involved in the EMT and other opportunities like this. I'll tell you more about what we've been doing for the tourism industry. What I want to say is that initially we are not specialized in that field. We are specialized in localization and marketing. But translation for tourism in some way can be assimilated to marketing translation.
Okay, thank you. Sorry if I caught you on the hop there. David?
Yes, slightly less of a hop. I had 2 minutes to think. David Catan. I teach tourism translation and have been doing so for the past 10 years at the University of Salento. And there began also cooperating with the museum, which opened only 3 years ago, and very interestingly, it's a museum of medieval Jewish museum. But what made it very interesting, as I got more and more involved in working on the interpretation panels, was how important it was for the people to understand, those reading in English, the fact that they were in a Catholic country, and that the background was very much an Italian historical background. And so I began to actually work with the things that I was talking about in theory, and now I'm on board, as Dave was mentioning in the very first introduction, to the board of governors of the museum. So I'm now responsible for anything that happens towards English.
Okay, thank you. And I come to Luca. Don't. It's very easy in this room to switch each other off. But I'm leaving Luca to last because some of you may have seen him from yesterday. But Luca, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, so welcome back, and I'm Luca CURIONI, Chief Digital Officer at Milan Municipality. How many of you already were present yesterday in my speech? Most of you, very nice. So I think you already did a great introduction. Today we will see a different story, same project, new website, but a different angle, the angle of the tourism portal we developed.
Okay. Thank you. Before we start, just a quick question. How many of you are actually involved in translation in the tourism industry? Hands up. Okay, all right, that's good. Interesting. And one thing, the title of this session is about mishaps and opportunities. I don't know if anyone has any mishaps or terrible translations or examples of terrible tourism translation that they would like to share with us from the room. Okay, oh good, all right, please.
Yes, I remember in Paris.
Press your microphone.
Yeah, I remember once in Paris, I was offered a tuna salad. TUNER.
Very crunchy. Okay. Any other things that we'd like to share at the moment? We should have briefed you beforehand. Go for it. Press your microphone.
Very nice menu in Prague. I am from the Czech Republic. It was skinned potatoes. What was meant by jacket potatoes?
Anyone else?
Just I was in Barcelona in a museum. They tried to do as many translations as they wanted, but it was quite a disaster because they've tried languages that are not really known in Spain, and it was obviously go translate or something like that, and it was a disaster. Like I think even the native speakers of these languages did not understand anything, and it was quite strange in this kind of museum. It was really bad experience, I think, for translators, and I was like, ugh.
Unfortunate misspellings, such as free wife instead of free Wi-Fi.
Excellent, excellent. Does anyone here have anything? No?
I'll give some. I have some in my presentation.
Oh, yeah. Well, we'll hear some more from Françoise in a moment. Okay, well, so, yes, there's a lot out there, and there's a lot of terrible stuff out there. But how hard is it to avoid these mistakes, particularly with people who don't understand the importance of translation and how it comes across to the visitor? We need to have more professional translation in tourism. After all, as Anthony Burgess, the British author of A Clockwork Orange, so he was interested in language, he said, translation is not a matter of words only, it is a matter of making intelligible a whole culture. Because it isn't just about the words, it's also about the culture behind them. And certainly we will be hearing some of that from our speakers this morning. So I'm now going to ask Françoise to start leading off the discussions while she does the walk over to the lectern over there. I told you this room is really a bit difficult to manage. But you will be able to see her on the screens as well if you're sitting over here, unless you want to look at her in person. So she's going to tell us a little bit more about her work translating menus for Air France. And I can assure you that the job is much more complicated than you would imagine. Just picture the idea of dealing with chefs and their flowery language and their big egos. You've got to make those menus intelligible to passengers, but you also have to be really careful that you tell them the ingredients inside, because if there's a problem, you could have, well, anyway, you know, you understand. So, Françoise BAJON, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Aminda. So, well, as I said, we are not overly specialized in tourism, but we've got a certain experience. Like many companies, translation companies, we've translated website, brochures, etc. We've also translated a lot because we did the very first version of Expedia, so hotel descriptions, at the time that they were not normalized. So it was quite a challenge because also it was always written in an approximate English, so it was a good experience. We did also a lot of luxury hotel literature, for example, like for chains like Orient Express or similar chains. As I live in France, a lot of ski resorts, promotional content, and finally, this is the case study that I'm going to present, the menus for Air France, which are currently a current project. Okay, so the challenges in the sector are varied. There is a multiplicity of actors. If you think of the number of hotels, of restaurants, it's a huge market, except that most of them have really tiny needs. And, well, the implementation of a translation is something that they feel is very difficult, okay? They've got to contact the people, how they will handle this, etc. On top of this, translation is not really taken seriously. That is to say, in general, for, well, 3-star hotel, they tell you, oh, we have a waiter who speaks English, and okay, well, I don't want to comment more. You know what it can mean, okay? The SEO constraints are important, and they are not aware of that. Although it's important for them, because generally the website is their window to the world. And I've spoken about the use of non-professional resources. One thing also to add is that the source text may not be that good for a certain number of actors. This is an example that I promised you earlier. This dates back from 3 weeks ago. I won't tell you where this was, although there is a clue. It's like in some programs. So for those who do not read French, so inconsistency everywhere, well, mistranslation for spirits, and, well, yeah, okay. Let's move to more interesting things. I discussed my experience with the organizers, and they found that our experience with Air France was something interesting to share with you. So, first of all, well, 3 years ago, 3-4 years ago, Air France decided that they wanted to really differentiate from competition, and they came up with this nice motto, France is in the air. There was a new campaign of ads, and clearly the positioning of the company was sophistication, imagination, dream, and lightness. So this is important because you've got to keep this in mind in the translation. And clearly, and I'm going to show you why, translating and printing the menus is a clear differentiating factor for Air France. So will this work? I hope so. So I have a short video of an ad. Well, everything that they are looking for in those menus is in this ad. Arrow. Sorry. So while Arrow is loading the video, yeah. Yeah, so one, it doesn't work, Harrow. So,
I hate this room.
yeah, so in this ad that I hope we'll see, because it really gives a good impression on what we are trying to achieve with Air France, you can see that they hired chefs to plan for the menus, famous sommeliers for the wine part, and they also decided to print the menus. Okay.
Voici Lee. Il est émerveillé. Vous voulez savoir pourquoi? Parce qu'il se laisse surprendre par la magie de la gastronomie. Pardon, de la haute gastronomie. Des menus imaginés par des chefs étoilés, servis avec élégance. Selon ses envies? Vraiment toutes ses envies. La gastronomie, par Air France.
Okay, well, so great, it worked. Thank you, Hara. So,
quand même, les imprimantes 3D, c'est pas terrible, quoi. Vous avez promis une révolution de fou, et puis, au final, personne n'y en a une chez lui, quoi. Je veux dire, toi, t'en as une, mais les gens, ils s'en foutent, quoi. En plus, les trucs que t'as.
Les inconvénients du direct. Okay, so I showed you this because, well, in this ad, they clearly set the floor, okay? Nice tableware, chefs, famous sommeliers, well, as I said, sophistication. So they expect this in the menus as well. And this is the challenge, of course. It's, okay. Yeah. So what does Air France menus represent? There are over 50 million passengers for Air France and every year. And so while there is not a menu in each flight, for the long haul, sometimes there are two menus, for example. And what you must know also, I'm sorry. What you must know also is sometimes they change, well, sometimes. No, they change the menu every week so that the frequent travelers avoid eating the same things 2 weeks in a row, okay? So this produces a great number of menus, or I should say dishes, because we do not translate the menus. We translate the, well, just the line of the dish. We don't have the context, which adds up to the whole thing. We translate into up to 29 languages, so it's not really a multilingual project. I would say it's a series of unilingual projects. That is to say, there is one source text, but the source text is not for all the languages. It varies according to the target languages. That is to say, the menu for a Japanese, for a flight to Japan will not apply for Brazil, for example. Okay. So the menus are tailored to each flight. One additional issue is that, well, the source text is French, and in some languages it becomes a challenge, in particular Asian languages. And of course, there is a short turnaround time. I don't know what's happening. Because we are part of a whole supply chain. That is to say, the menus are uploaded in the system. Then we translate them. They go to the printer. And then there is a freight, a freight company that transports the menus at the bottom of the flights, of the planes, sorry, excuse me. These are the menus that we translate. And I took a picture of you to show you the sophistication that Air France is looking for. So, the one at the bottom on the left is the menu for the economy class. You see it's rather small. It's on a very standard paper. Premium economy is on glossy paper, a little larger, and then you see that business is even larger. We get a very nice design as well. And finally, at the back, you can see La Première class, which is, business class, of course. And what you must know is that maybe these are printed in 20 copies, because in each flight, there are only 20 business passengers. So you see the kind of challenge that we are facing, because for business passengers, we're not going to allow any mistake. This is what they look like inside. Just to give you an idea, I won't go into details. I'll give you some more. These are some parts which are more dedicated to enology or to the chef's description. So what are the challenges? The target audience is very demanding, of course. The chef's poetry of words, that is to say, the way it's worded, is sometimes challenging. For example, if you have a filet de flétan en habit vert, what does en habit vert means? And of course, you must think about what you want to convey to your passenger. The ingredients and the recipes that do not exist in other cultures or languages, and even for, no later than last week, we found new ingredients after 3 years of translation. You would think that you would have seen everything. No. Polysemic terms, for example. When a chef writes gâteau de pomme, well, he doesn't want to say pomme de terre because it's not very elegant, so he says pomme. But when you send this to be translated into Hindi, well, you need to address that type of things. Another word which is interesting is céleri. In French, we have 2 types of celery, and in English, it's celery and celeriac. So we systematically have to ask which one is it, because in other languages, it may have an impact. And ambiguous wording, of course. So we have created a specific translation model for Air France, where we have a scanning process at the beginning. We scan everything that is to be translated in search of potential ambiguities, helping the foreign translators to identify what are the traps and what they must be careful about. We've adapted the workflows and the processes to meet the high expectations, and we have a special customer care for Air France at the level of what they are providing to their passengers. Yes, I'm sorry, I have to, I can give you other indications in the questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sorry, it's always, we've got too many speakers and too little time. It's always a problem in these conferences. Thank you. Very interesting. And of course, technology problems. You can tell this is not the technology session. Okay, and just so you know, the presentations will be available on the event website, so you can actually see the slides that you may have missed and things like that. So don't worry, you're not going to miss out eventually. You can see them all. And I mean, next time I fly Air France, I'm certainly going to be paying a little bit more attention to the menus, that's for sure, and realizing the incredible hard work behind it, really, which I think we just probably take for granted. We're now going to go to Luca Curioni, who we saw yesterday talking about Milan City Council website. If you want to go and make yourself comfortable. Today he's going to focus on the tourism side of that project, where everyone was very, machine translation yesterday. Well, on the tourism side, there's a lot less of that, and it's a lot more human translation. And Luca will tell us why, and talk about how the fact that in some things they go even beyond our normal translation, and they go for cultural mediation. Where they actually almost do transcreation with the target countries. So please give Luca Curioni a good welcome.
Okay, so back to where we began yesterday. We are talking to citizen, city user, talents, investors and visitors. Today we will focus more on how we approach the new website dedicated to visitor, talents and investors. This website needs to address a specific need. So the need is information about the city attractiveness. So the strategy and the opportunity we are following here is again aligned with the needs of our users, and in this case we create a website focusing on storytelling about the city. So completely different from the city of the council, where it was, as I was saying, a very lean and bare-bone, even bare-bone communication here, and about the city council services. Here's more about the city as a whole, and it needs to, and the stakeholder we have that brings the interest is not only the city council itself, but is all the tourist attraction, hoteling, and all the community and the tourism industry that is behind. So we create Yes Milano. It's pretty a young project, so it's a brand itself created less than 1 year ago. We are focusing effort right now in providing the brand awareness within the city. The website itself is still little in terms of audience. We are talking about 100K visit per month, but it's growing double digit. So talking about 50% growth month over month. The target is not so small, because we are talking about 1 million tourists in September. So, and Milan, it's the first visited city in Italy and 14th in the world. So that's is what we need to do. We are now working still on the SEO currently. So we are down at the third page of Google if you search Milan event, because it's pretty hard to compete with the specialized from Expedia or these kind of activities. So how it looks like. This is the website, yesmilano.it. First of all, since we need to communicate to the full audience, but we also are looking as a first page to the most prominent audience, and more than 90% of the visits are from tourists. So the welcome page is about tourists, but then if you see in the top left part, there's access to students, and then business. So students is about describing to talents how that want to transfer and live in Milan or study in Milan. And business is the area where we communicate to investors that want to invest and open up a business activity in Milan. The website is available, so let's deal with the translation stuff. So no automatic translation here. We went for creating specific content for each of the targets. So we have, for the international target, we are producing content in English, and then we have the Italian content produced in Italian. Some content is being translated from Italian to English, but and we are doing this with two copywriters. One of them it's a native language speaker. As I was saying, it's still a pretty small website, so that's the elements. And when we are trying to look to the content, you can see that on the international one, that this snapshot comes from, I think, 2 weeks ago. The content, it's about what the international guys are looking after Milan. You see Leonardo, 500 years, then there's wine. On the other part, on the Italian part, there's content related to people who lives in Milan and want to look for the local activities. So you see a week, that is this format that we use in Milan, dedicated to mountains and what to do in the weekend with local events about the city. As you can see, no, you cannot see because it's very small, but also on the top part, the effort dedicated to the translation is not actually a translation per se. Events is translated as what's on or travel info instead of consigli pratici. So it's pretty trying to put the not a translation but a specific element into the label. And that is how we are trying to work. Of course, there will be also mistake over there, but that's the approach following there. And then I spent the word cultural mediation because what we are trying to do to attract specific part, a specific culture, it's looking after a specific channel because probably a .it website is not attractive at all as a channel for the Chinese tourism. So we develop a partnership with Tencent, that is the company running WeChat, and to boost the tourism in China with specific content designed around that culture. And so there's a lot of talking about, for example, our new city, that wonderful place that is there. It's a new building, so it's part of the new Milan, not the traditional one. Or we're talking about soccer. That is something that for that market is it's an attraction of the city, and that is how we are pushing content. So going back for probably was the speech of the first day. We are really dealing with effective communication here rather than talking about the translation. Complete different approach on the one that I was describing last day. Okay.
Thank you. And our last speaker before we start taking questions. Well, in fact, I want to ask you, you can make yourself comfortable, but a quick question to the room. Anyone here involved in translation in tourism does this cultural mediation and transcreation? Hands up, anyone? One person, two people. Okay, three? Okay. All right, so not many. But we're going to hear a little bit more now from our next speaker about why this is actually so important. Luca's already mentioned it, and we're now going to take it a little bit further. David Catan is from the University of Salento in the beautiful city of LEIGH. And he knows that the needs of tourists are actually very different in very different cultures. And so there is interventions are needed on the translation and literally turning the text, getting rid of the source text and starting from scratch. David has seen, however, that translation is very much overlooked in the tourism industry, even though it is a huge part of the business and is a very serious subject area. Many people just ignore it and think that professional translation is really only needed in things like legal business texts. So David is now going to show us how mistaken that approach is. Give him a warm welcome.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and you've stolen the first half of my talk, so it'll become a little shorter, which is possibly not a bad thing. Yes, the academic view, but also, as I mentioned earlier, tempered with the fact that I've been cooperating, working, collaborating with a museum locally. And I want to look at text purposes and relate them to the cultural aspect in translation, and that will be where the transcreation, where the cultural mediation comes in. And also move on from translation as communication to translation as narration. And I want to finish with just one slide on an area which I think is very important. I'm whistling, but that's life. And that's the storytelling element that Luca just mentioned. As Aminda mentioned, yes, clearly tourism is important. International tourism, certainly down in southern Italy, has suddenly become huge business. And clearly an international tourist needs or wants a fairly friction-free move around the world. And so translation is absolutely essential for that. Now, sounds much better. However, all tourists are outsiders, and so what's very interesting about translation in the tourism sector is you've got two sets of outsiders. You have the whistling outsiders.
Sorry, can I just ask the technicians to come and sort this out for us? Thank you.
Epistemic outsiders, those who just don't know about the specialized material, or they don't know the menu that's in front of them. All tourists are in a very different situation to other types of readers. If we think of medical translations or legal translations, it's very often from peer to peer, although popularization is important. In this particular case, tourism translation is always towards the outsider. But when we translate, there's a second stage of outsidership, and that's the socio-cultural outsider. And in the case of the museum that I've been collaborating with, very interesting because it's a museum of medieval Jewish life. But of course, the Catholic, the Italian, the history of Italy, which is important to understand what's happened to the Jews, is not explained because the locals know that. So the outsiders need a second layer of popularization, if you like, of making explicit what is simply not in the surface text. The third element that I think makes tourism translation very important, special and different is that most of it, and this was mentioned earlier, is marketing, whether it's informative or not. The menu, for example, isn't just informing about the menu, but it's marketing Air France, it's marketing its refinedness, and so on and so forth. And so the tourist who is generally not having to read unlike the lawyer who has to read the contract that's been translated, we have to be in a position to involve, to allow, or rather oblige, the reader to go through the text, because they're not generally, when tourists, in that case. So these are three basic areas of tourism translation that I think are very important. But I'd look at the culture through three ways of looking at texts themselves. Possibly. Or possibly not. Okay. We've already seen that many of us work in tourism translation. The cultural part is often very much just given. It's important, but as the EMT tells us, it's very much the driving force behind, and it's not actually described what the cultural component is. So we'll look at three types of tourism texts and understand, or have a look at, vouloir, savoir, and pouvoir faire. Not very different to other taxonomies, but you'll see that one of them I think is particularly interesting. The vouloir is there to stimulate interest. It's the I want to go there. And it depends on the push factors, the hot buttons, the values that I have, or that we have, and that cultures generally have, that entice us to go to Salento, to Brussels, to other beautiful places. And these will vary according to culture. Very quick example, because time is limited. Italians love Scotland, and the mountains of Scotland and the solitude really does attract, and the push buttons are there, except for well-behaved children and or dogs welcome. And clearly, for a family-oriented culture, this feels like racism. And it's not very much a vouloir. The savoir is there to give knowledge. Wikipedia. It's more informative, it's lexically much more dense. The area that affects the cultures is, of course, as I've already mentioned, the level of background that's expected. And that will vary according to culture. We've already mentioned the Jewish museum, but without the Italian culture of the 15th, 16th century, you're going to understand very little. The third one, and this is the one that I find most interesting, is the, I'll give you just an example of a savoir. This is in the museum itself. Here we have the information panel, and as you can see, the information panels are fully adorning the museum itself. There's not much else there. There's just information panels. There's very little to actually see apart from the text. So it's a case where the text tells the story. And it begins with this, translated into English. Everyone knows about Baroque Lecce, but this is just the most recent part of a long history. As an international visitor, you're not really encouraged to, well, you are encouraged to feel stupid. Because not many of us internationally will know much about Baroque Lecce. So clearly the sorts of changes to make are things like, well, Baroque Lecce is well known, but the 17th century. So stealth inclusions, we don't notice the translator's been there, but we are now on more solid ground and we know where we're starting from. Third case, and this is the one I think which is the most interesting, the pouvoir faire. This is the type of text that allows you as a tourist to act as if you're not a tourist. You can actually go and eat, you can actually go and visit, you can actually go and catch the bus or catch the train. And this is the area that translators in general miss out totally. I'll give an example for translating not really for outsiders, which covers all three areas. So this is how to drink coffee in Trieste. Trieste is a coffee city and proudly loves its coffee. And here is a translation into English. To each his own coffee. Well, okay, it was a long time ago. The vouloir, at the very beginning, this is extremely important. We're enticed into the text, and we read in a Triestine cafe, one can hear orders like this. Give me a long decaffeinated cappuccino in a cold glass. Clearly, we're unlikely to hear the English in Trieste. They don't speak English, they speak Triestine or Italian. And secondly, of course, we get the imperative. It's not the most obvious way to bring a reader into the actual reality there. The savoir part here, the cappuccino is not the same as it is everywhere else. Good. There are subtle variations such as the gocciato. Good, but clearly we're not being told anything more. We're left in limbo. We know, we don't know. And that's as much as we do know. The pouvoir faire, though, I think is the most interesting here, whereby we're actually told how to drink the coffee as a local. It actually says, okay, coffee is still coffee, but if you wish to enter into the local spirit, then it's best to ask for a, and here we know, here is the word in Italian, and we ask. And of course, if we ask, we'll probably bring to mind Robert De Niro, because Nero would be the English pronunciation where the Italian pronunciation is nero. And it's as different as ship and sheep. And clearly that first understanding is the wrong one, and the translators simply did not consider the fact that the tourist was an outsider. What I want to finish off with, in the last 15 and a half a minute, is the fact that we need to move towards narrative theory and towards storytelling, particularly when we've got information panels. Here is Deep L, who's translated a panel perfectly. The visitor will enter the streets of the ancient medieval city, meeting the people who populated it with their daily activities. Apulians, Venetians, Albanians, Greeks, and especially Jews who lived in the neighborhood. Fine. But it's a list. It's not very involving. There's nothing wrong with it. But there is a surface structure there. The writer had a deep structure in the sense that he knew who these people were. And these people were individuals, they were parts of a community. So the translation is much more now involving. You, not the visitor, are now about to start your journey through the streets and alleys, because we're going back in time, of ancient medieval LEIGH, just to remember where we are. And on these streets you'll meet the people who were living there at the time. Local Pulians, Venetian merchants, and from across the sea, and we're dividing and we're allowing the reader to get involved and feel that this is a narration. What was great about this was two things. One, the writer began to get interested, and the Q&A sessions that Dave was talking about earlier actually began to happen. And what is great is that the Italian has now taken on between 15 and 20% of the additions and the changes that I made. And TripAdvisor reports talk about nice to read stories rather than nice to read translations. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. We do have a little bit of time for your questions. We already have 6 questions on Slido. Quite a few of them are for Françoise, though I think perhaps we'll be getting others, and there will be, I'll take a couple from the room, but please, when I come to you in the room, please keep your questions short so that we can also hear our replies, which are quite useful. Françoise, I'm going to ask you to answer the first Slido question, which has got the most votes. What is your quality assurance process, given the turnaround times and other challenges that you mentioned?
Okay, so this is the other challenge, I would say. We don't have the necessary time to have a proper validation phase. So what happens is that we've put on a certain number of checks which relate to the use of terminology. For example, we spot every dish which, includes pork, for example, to make sure that this has not been mistranslated, because it's very important not to make a mistake on this. So there are a certain number of checks like this after translation, and as we progressed in the translation of the menus, we add new checks, okay, automatic checks. So this is the thing that we've put, and that happens immediately. And then, as we are pressed by time, it goes to the printer. It's put on the plane. So we do regular tests of texts that have been translated to measure the level of correctness that we reach. Right now, we are above 99%. So it's quite good. At least Air France is happy with it. And what is most surprising is that Air France relies on the passenger to give the feedback, which ends up with our getting a certain number of feedback, which are, most of them are erroneous, because passengers make spelling mistakes, for example, and they correct you while it should not be corrected. Well, also the flying crew is, well, giving feedback, except that they don't have necessarily the source text. So sometimes things appear strange, but it's not our fault, it's the chef's fault. Well, you know, you've got to do with what you have. So it's quite complex, the validation, and it's absolutely outside of any standard that we've known in our history.
Okay, there are some more questions for you, but there's one question that has been going up the order, and I actually think it's very interesting. Is there much work in translation in tourism? I was under the impression during my master's that it would be difficult to find work in this specific sector. I don't know who of our panelists would like to, I don't know, David, actually, I think probably we'll start with you.
Well, there's a huge amount of work. One of the things I didn't mention at the very beginning is that about a quarter of the translators who I surveyed out of 922 mentioned that they translate tourism some of the time, and 1 out of 9 that were interviewed, that's their major job. So it's up there with all the other areas of specialized translation, except until this year, nobody's really looked at tourism as a specialized translation course. Out of 43 universities in Britain and Ireland, 1 has a master's in specialized translation. But I believe that's going to change rapidly, and it is changing rapidly. My students, we do a course in tourism translation. It's not a master's in tourism translation. They go off and they are working solidly in the tourism industry. And that's going to expand.
Yeah, in fact, let me say in another way, we are not even buying a translation here. As I was saying, we are look for someone who copyright directly in that language with the cultural mediation of that language. So, and the market and the demand there, it's pretty huge. So I believe that that's the direction, as also David was saying at the beginning.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to take a couple of questions from the room now. One over there, one over there. I knew there was going to be someone on that side. All right, we'll take you two first, and then we'll see if we have any more time. It's going to be difficult. You have to turn around and get a microphone behind you. Sorry, it's a bit awkward.
Good morning. My name is Claudia Kavita. I'm from Transperfect and also member of the LEIGH expert group with Françoise. So I have a question for you, Françoise. There is no trick. You were saying that it was a little bit, problematic sometimes translating, the ingredients because you have polysemy and things like this. But do you have like pictures of the dishes?
No, that's something that I didn't allude to. No, we have absolutely no picture. And so we have a whole workflow of questions again, it's complicated because it goes to Air France, then it goes to Server, which is their subsidiary for everything for food, and then it goes to the chefs. Of course, the chefs have designed the menus 3 or 4 months ago. So you've got to catch them because they've got other things to do than answer what is the habit vert. I would say that we receive answers about that type of questions for 90% well, 80% of the questions we ask, and then the translators have to deal with the 20% as much as they can. So it's...
Thank you.
Yeah, this is...
Aminda, I'd like to add about the previous question about is there work? Yes, there is work, I think. It takes profiles, well, translators' profiles who have a lot of culture. You do not translate in tourism if you don't have a lot of culture. And, well, in the case I took, it's... well, gastronomy, so it's one side of culture, but for museums, it's another side of cultures.
Thank you.
Yes, this is Giuseppe Palumbo from the University of Trieste, where, as we've heard, coffee is the best in the world. Now, a comment and a question for the panel. Well, the first comment is, I've been asked by my university to translate some stuff into English, and one thing was the 10 reasons why international students should enroll in our university. And one of the reasons in Italian was, on average, our students take 3.5 years to complete 3-year degrees. Which to Italians makes perfect sense, but to anybody else in the world, it doesn't. So we just scrapped that reason and we replaced it with something else. That's an example of a cultural filter. The question is, for the panel, what happens if you translate, because this is what happens most of the time, you're translating into English for an international audience. Now, to me, that's the opposite of localization, because if you translate into English, what's the locale? There's no locale to speak of. So what do you do there? What were your ideas in those terms?
Well, you're absolutely right. It's delocalization. And what you do is you get to that common threshold of understanding at an international level, and you realize that the text is de-anchored totally. And you have to then think about which of the original anchors are going to be useful in that particular moment. And that's where you start expanding. But you need to be aware that you can't do it all because the text just gets unhealthily long. So it's then a process of what then to cut out, because in general, who's ever commissioning the translation doesn't want an extended opus. But you're absolutely right. And it's something with, for example, machines can't really think about or consider, because the idea of anchoring into anywhere is not what the machine's interested in. They're translating.
And just to pick you up on that, because that comes into something that someone said on Slido, which is that your presentation underscores the fine nuances and skills storytelling that can be copied but never matched by machines. So that's an interesting thing for you to bear in mind. Luca, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, exactly. On the question, and I think is also the experience as a tourist. For example, if I look to myself when I want to look for information for a German city, and I find by chance the Italian translation, probably I will go for the English one, because that's my experience as an international tourist visiting another country. That's probably for most of our language here in Europe. This is not true for all the culture, and that is where we came at the Tencent Alliance for the Chinese culture. So.
Okay, and Françoise has an answer to the person, Victor's question on cost-revenue ratio for 20 hard copy menu translation.
Yes, so I decided to travel to Tokyo next week by Air France, of course, and business class. So the best rate is 6,644 euros. So, well, the price of the menu is included.
I wondered what you were doing.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think at that point, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it. Thank you for sending in all your questions on Slido. Thank you for your questions from the floor, and I hope you enjoyed the session. Please do give our panelists a big round of applause. You now have 10 minutes to sort yourselves out and get yourselves into your seat for the final keynote speech.